Hey, welcome back, you guys. Are you ready to do some amazing writing? I can feel it. I know you guys are. We are going to continue and we're going to look at a different time period, but guess what? The strategy of Abe still works because the structure of the questions are the exact same. We are going to look at two historians. We're going to find either a similarity or a difference, which is the answer. We're going to give their argument, because remember, these historians aren't just stating a fact. They're not saying Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. No, they're going to give an argument like, was Christopher Columbus a good person, or was Christopher Columbus a bad person? And so for period 4, this is an exciting time period. There are so many changes going on. And this is going from 1800, where we see the election of Thomas Jefferson, till 1848, where we see the beginnings of the Mexican-American War. And within that 48 years, there's so many things going on. We've got democracy expanding. We've got at the exact same time, we've got people's rights who are being taken away. So we're going to look at some historians who have some opinions about these topics. And we're going to look at what those arguments are, and we are going to provide some examples to support their arguments. Here we go. Let's go into period 4. It's going to be awesome. All right. Now, you should have these examples in front of you, and so you should be able to take some time to really go through these two components. We're going to focus on the writing aspect of it. And so remember, before we even look at a secondary source, what question should we always look for first? That's right, question A. Because remember, question A is going to give us some good clues. For example, we need to know, are these two historians giving a similar idea or are they giving a different idea? And we can tell right here that they are giving a different idea. And so we can use that to guide us, where it's like, okay, I read one, seemed to make sense, read the other one, it didn't. Okay, I can go back to the one that made sense, figure out what they're saying, assume the second is arguing differently, the opposite, and then read it again with that lens to figure out if that's what they're saying. And then we also want to know what the topic is. And so before we even start reading, we can tell that the topic is early reform movements. We want to know these two people's ideas on reforms. Okay, were they good? Were they bad? Where did they start? Who was big? Those are questions that these historians could be arguing. So we want to know that that's the topic that we're looking at. And then remember, B and C are going to start looking at examples to support that. So when we write our answers for question A, we want to make sure that we're including the answer. And since they're giving arguments, we've got to state that argument. And the argument naturally flows with the word because. Okay, you're arguing for something. And then question B and C are our examples that we're going to be looking at to get a feel to support what these historians are arguing. So take a moment, go ahead and pause, read through these two secondary sources and get a feel for what they're saying. Maybe think of how you would write it, and let's look at how someone writes it using the strategy with Abe. Now remember, question A was asking us to write down the difference of their arguments. And so first of all, we have to identify what the argument is, the difference is, and then we have to look at their argument and see how are they arguing their opinion on this. And so let's look at how someone wrote question A to get a feel for what this question might look like. So this person wrote, Walter's and Guru's interpretation of early reform movements differ over influences of the reform movements. Walters argues early reform movements were influenced largely by local volunteer groups because these groups were able to address different reforms that could effectively make change on the local level. However, Guru argues reform movements were largely influenced by the large philosophical movement of transcendentalism because the fundamental beliefs of individual worth and rights challenged traditional ideas at the time. All right, can you see the answer? What was the difference? Well, this writer wrote that the difference was influences of the reform movements. So now we got to look at how they're arguing and what they think the difference is. And so this individual wrote that Walter argues that reform movements were influenced by local volunteer groups. So that's his answer. But remember, he's not giving just a fact. He's arguing. He's providing an opinion piece. And so he's saying, look, I think it's local volunteer groups because these groups were able to address different reforms that could effectively make change. Now, Guru, remember that they're different because Walter's saying it's local. Guru is basically saying, look, there was a large philosophical movement of transcendentalism, and that was what's influenced. So there's his answer. But he's going to give you an argument because the ideas, the fundamental beliefs of these ideas challenged the ideas at the time. So one person is, Walter is saying, look, these were just local people that were making changes on a local level. And then you have Guru who's saying, look, this was a large thing. There was an idea of philosophical change. And because that philosophical change, people's ideas changed. And because people's ideas changed, they wanted to change the world. They're both pretty good opinions. Can we find some examples to support it? Well, let's look at Walter's first. So Walter wrote, or this person wrote, that a development that supports Walter's interpretation that reform movements were largely influenced by local organization is the rise of the idea of Republican motherhood and increasing women's education in the early 1800s. So here is our event or development. We've got this idea to support it, which was the emergence of Republican motherhood, and we've got the development of women's education. So how does this fit the argument? They write, as more women became educated, they began to participate more in the reform movements within their local communities. This supports Walter's idea as women often reforms that would directly affect their local communities, such as the temperance movement. So they're saying, look, women's education is what made it local, and because of that, it expands and creates more reform movements. Let's see what Guru would have to say to support theirs. So this person is saying, a development that supports Guru's interpretation that reform movements were largely influenced by the transcendental movement was the rise of the abolition movement. And so here is our example, was the abolition movement and it becoming more popular. They write, transcendentalism's influence of spiritual beliefs of equality would lead to many of the leaders to later emerge in the abolitionist movement. For example, transcendentalism, Henry David Thoreau's famous writing, Civil Disobedience, argued against the government's institution of slave policies. The ideas of the transcendentalist movements merged with the actions of the abolitionists. And so you can see how in each of these cases, remember, we're arguing. And so it's not enough just to state an answer, but you've got to give your argument. And B and C is specifically looking for, okay, now be a historian, go back in time and find something specific. Notice how each of these are almost like a vocabulary word, right? We're looking for something that we would find in a textbook that could support it. And you want something specific to support it. So let's give it a try. We are going to practice writing about with Andrew Jackson and kind of maybe some historians' opinion about Andrew Jackson. Remember that in each of these cases, we're not reading a textbook paragraph. We're reading someone's opinion piece on what they think of the topic. So use question A and remember to keep in mind that they are an opinion. And so they're going to have an answer. They're going to support it. So there's our magical because, and you are going to help them by finding an example that could support that argument. Good luck.